Hello YouTubers, Toby Till here with Rocky Mountain Snow MX. We are here to provide you with all of your snow bike related technical videos and also any parts or accessories you may need for your snow bike. Feel free to give us a call, 720-263-7533. Hello YouTubers, Toby Till here with Rocky Mountain Snow MX. We have a customer system in here for a little refresh. This is a 2019 Yeti 129 Super Sport. We're going to kind of go through it for the customer, make sure that he's good to go for the season. So here are some of the bases that we check. We're going to get into the belt drive, check and see if the pulleys are worn. We're going to get into the jack shaft, see if the counter shaft drive sprocket on the jack shaft is worn. We're also going to look at bushings, high facts, just some regular kind of maintenance. So let's get started. I'll give you some tips and tricks as it kind of goes along the way to help you with your maintenance. That way you can really see what's going on. So first thing we're going to do is remove the locking nut. It holds the belt tension. Then we'll back off your belt tension adjuster. Then we'll loosen the belt tension adjuster. Then we'll grab a hold of the pulleys. Now, one thing you always want to remember is never swap the belt. If you swap the belt, it'll break just as soon as you take off. So what I always do is when I take it off, we're going to take the cover, lay the belt on the cover, just a nice quick trick so that you know which way it goes on. Your washers that are behind the gear drives, don't forget to remove and replace those when you go back together. So the very first thing that I'm going to check is I'm going to check and see if our lower pulley is worn to the lower drive shaft. It obviously came off fairly easy. And so we're just going to slide it right back on the splines. And I'm just going to check for excessive play. So as you can tell, there is a very slight amount of play that is starting to wear. So we're not going to replace it at this time, but if that does start to wear and wears more, with it being loose on the shaft, that allows it to rock back and forth when you come on and off the gas. As you're coming on and off the gas and it's rocking back and forth, it is breaking the Loctite on this lower bolt loose, and the lower bolt will be loose. So with this amount of play, and it's a little amount of play, you've got some ways to go. But as you're checking bolt tension and as your kit gets more and more hours on it, you definitely need to be looking at the bolt tension here. because if those are getting loose, you have pulley to shaft wear, and you're going to need to replace that pulley before it strips all the way out. So the first telltale on a pulley wear is if your bolts are getting loose. So always check that. Next, we're going to take a look at the jack shaft bearings. You always want to make sure you use a really good sharp tool, because sometimes these can be really tight. And if you're using a new sharp tool, the chances of stripping them out are very little. You always want to break them loose by hand before you get started with removing the jack shaft. Almost all 18s, 19 and newer, have what's called a floating bearing here on the inside of the jack shaft. You never want to take those 4 bolts loose when you're doing any kind of maintenance on the shaft, because if you take these 4 bolts loose, it will allow the floating bearing to move, and you'll have to realign your belt. But I'm going to show you a little trick that you can use to leave those in place. So the next thing we do is we're going to press the jack shaft and jack shaft plate out of the floating bearing. Once again, without ever taking these 4 bolts loose. So all we really have to do is get it moving. Make sure that you have all 7 bolts loose out of the bearing retention plate. Voila. Pop it loose. Once you have your jack shaft plate out, now you can really look at the slop here. So a little slop on the gears is okay. A little slop here is not, because this is starting to wear. Once this gear wears, it starts to wear on the tie shaft. Then of course you have a mishap. While you have this out, it's a good idea to just go ahead and check your bearings here. If I feel this shaft, the outer bearing feels okay, but the inner bearing does not. So we're definitely going to replace both bearings, since we're going to pull them off to replace this anyway. So here we go with bearing replacement. You're going to use the Yeti tool to pull the outer bearing off of the jack shaft. Now that we've got the bearing off, we can remove the snap ring. Now we can remove the gear. Once we remove the gear, we'll test the gear on the splines that it used to ride on, and we'll test it on the outer. There's almost as much slop on the outer splines as there is in the inner. So we're actually going to replace that gear with a new one. The new gear will allow us to go ahead and take up that slop and not have any issue. While we're here, we're definitely going to remove the bearing and replace it. Snap ring out. We're going to center things up on this socket so that we are supporting the bearing housing equally. Drive the bearing out. All right, next thing we're going to do with our jack shaft to replace the bearing is drive the bearing off of the jack shaft. And just so everybody knows, all of your bearings, everything you need to know torque-wise on your Yeti is all in your owner's manual, including all of the parts. So here, we're going to need a number 3 and a number 4. So we need a 1259 and a 1260 to go back on there. The original SS's 2018 had smaller drivers, and they ran a 14-tooth jack shaft sprocket, which when you go to the larger drivers of 2019 and newer, that same sprocket is a little small. You have too high of a gear in most cases for customers. So whenever I find a 14 gear with the large driver sprockets, I go ahead and switch it out to a 16. Now, I still do have some slop here, but it's nothing like this original gear. So we're going to go ahead and reuse this shaft. There's not too much slop in it. Plus the gear binding compound that Yeti is recommending now to use between the gear and the shaft will help that out too. So we're going to replace the sprocket on this unit. I want to make sure I get the bearings in the right places. The 6205 goes on this side of the jack shaft. So you don't have to get super fancy with your press tools. Just kind of need to watch what you're doing. We put a little bit of grease on the shaft because this is a steel inner bearing. Without grease on the shaft, you will have rust there eventually, which makes it tougher to get apart next time. So, now just press the bearing back on the shaft. You want to make sure that the bearing seats fully. Once the bearing's seated fully, now we can clean up this shaft a little bit. Make sure that we don't have anything hanging around. To mess with our gear binding compound. These are seal bearings, so when you're using seal bearings, you don't have to be really concerned about contamination getting into the bearing when you're cleaning it and things like that. You also want to clean the ends really well. Get out all the leftover blue Loctite. A little bit of brake clean, clean things up. Okay, now that we've got the bearing pressed onto the jack shaft, we are going to press it back into our jack shaft bearing plate housing. We're going to support the bearing plate housing. We're going to tap the bearing back into the housing. Make sure that it is going down into everything square, and you'll be good to go. All right, so once we've got the bearing in onto the jack shaft, we're going to put it into the bearing race housing. Check to make sure that you're all squared up, and whatever press tool you're using is only pressing on the outer race. And simply just tap it down into your retain. Once the bearing is fully seated, you should be able to see the snap ring groove and reinstall the snap ring. You want to make sure that your snap ring is fully seated in its groove. Bearing feels good. Snap ring's fully seated. We are ready to proceed. Now what we'll do next is Yeti Specs Loctite 648 for the gear retention. And so we'll put 648 on the splines and we will install the gear. Fully seat the gear against the snap ring. Make sure that the outside snap ring is exposed and ready to be installed. Install the snap ring on the outside, making sure that it fully seats in the ring lamp. Once you've done that, you can now get a little grease. And install the outside bearing. You can tell it really doesn't take much force at all to put these bearings into place. You want to make sure that they are fully seated. Shaft. And now, we'll go ahead and put a little bit more grease bearing OD. Oh, and I didn't point that out. You do need grease also on the bearing outside race inside of the housing. All the grease does is just keeps it from rusting, makes it disassembly down the road a little easier. While you're here, go ahead and put some grease on the inside of the floating bearing retainer. Make sure that your bolt hasn't fallen out. Make sure that the rubber seal inside here has not fallen out. Get a straight shot with your floating bearing. Primary installation. Don't try to force this. Let it go in and just kind of walk in. Once you get it straight, you just work it in with your fingers, just like that. Perfect. Now that that's in, you can go ahead and put your bolts back in. Blue Loctite on these guys. And we'll go ahead and torque these bolts to spec, 25 Newton meters. And that's all there is to it, to replacing bearings on jack shaft, both inner and outer, along with gear replacement for chain drive. I'm going to start out right at the point to where we've got the belt drive removed, and we are going to service the lower axle and bearings on a Yeti system. This is of course, 2018 through 2018, 2019 will all be this way. 2021 and 2020 are just slightly different. So not huge changes, but enough to mention. So first thing we're going to do is take our track loose. Don't take the track loose too much on those bolts because you will fold in the snap rings on them. So just enough for the nuts to be loose. Those were the big 17mm nuts on the back of the track here. Now we're going to take the 8mm headed bolts, run them out so that the track tension will become loose. Now, you don't need to fully remove the skid from the system to just service the drive shaft and the bearings and the brakes, but it does make it a lot easier. We're also going to do some other things while we're here with this kit. Check a few other things out, so we are going to go ahead and remove the skid. So you always want to take track wrench and tension loose before you remove skid bolts. What I always try to do is loosen them, break the lot tight, tighten them back up. Because if the other side is really in there, it's going to spin. You can totally do all this with the unit on the bike, but because this one's off, I'm going to make my life a little easier and do it upside down. Once you've got the 4 bolts out, makes it now super easy to go ahead and just lift the track and the skid and pull the skid out of the track. Like I said, on the bench it makes it really easy. All right, so now that we got that off, we'll take our brake caliper off. So to remove the drive shaft from the skid, you do need to remove the brake line. Anytime you remove the brake line, the copper washers you do want to replace because they are one-time use crushed copper washers. All of your 6mm Allens, anywhere on the kit, they're all blue Loctited in. I highly recommend breaking them loose by hand. I have seen many of the heads strip out if caution is not used when removing. So I just go through by hand, loosen them all up by hand. Now while you're working on this, it's a good time to inspect the belt drive cover. Make sure that there are no cracks in the belt drive cover, nothing you can't live with. One word of caution, do not ever use brake clean anywhere on a belt drive cover. Brake clean will eat a belt drive cover as soon as it touches it. So, big word of caution, you need to clean up your belt drive cover, just use soapy water. Don't use brake clean. Removing the caliper sometimes is a little bit of a chore between the driver and the kit, but if you have it in just the right position, there is kind of a notch on the top side of the driver that it'll come out easily with. Now you can remove the 4 bearing retainer screws. All right, so now once this is loose, you'll be able to see that on updated 2018s, 2019s, you will have this brake shroud rotor cover. You can remove that. Now that that's all out of the way, we can start to remove the drive shaft. We'll take all the bolts out of it. I'm sorry, I did do this slightly out of order because on the 19 and newers, the bolt retaining plate where the press goes into is in the brake shaft. So, gotta have that in there to be able to press them off. highly recommend using the Yeti press tool. I've had a few customers that didn't want to spend the money on this and decided that they were going to do it themselves without buying the tool. Those same customers have been back buying bearings. So Yeti press tool is definitely a tool that I would recommend purchasing and having when you're doing this kind of service. Cautious when you're installing these bolts. They do thread into a nut plate. As they're threaded into a nut plate, if you cross thread them going in, you will have to get a new nut plate, so be cautious when you're starting. You can now drive the tool in, you can then drive the drive shaft through the pit, brings it out on this other side. Pulls the bearing off of the drive shaft. Once you remove the bearing from the drive shaft, you want to check the bearing, see how it feels. This one feels really good. Now we'll move over to the other side. As you can see at this point, you can remove the bearing backing plate, the shield guard, and the rotor and hub assembly all together. This is as far as we need to go to check this out. If this bearing feels good, we're going to go forward with reassembly. And this bearing does feel good. Now we're moving over to the non-belt drive side to remove the drive shaft. Then we'll take that apart and do the new brake recall upgrade for the 2018-2019 Yeti brakes. So here we go. So using the Yeti puller, we'll get behind the bearing. We've already removed the non-drive side and bearing and retainer. Now we're moving over to the drive side. We've simply just pushed the drive shaft out a little bit so that we can create the clearance that we need for the back side of the puller. If this tries to rotate, I always run the inside bolts all the way through to the shoulders. That way I can set those bolts into the holes in the tunnel and kind of use the tunnel to hold the puller as I'm extracting the bearing. Now that the bearing and bearing retainer are off of the drive side, we'll be able to pull the drive shaft out. I always go forward and reset my tools, that way they're just ready to go for the next pull. Okay, now we have the drive shaft completely out. One thing I did not do is I didn't check the bearing once we had it out. I checked it once the drive shaft was in it. The bearing feels really good. There's no side-to-side play, and it does not feel rough at all. So we're not going to change that bearing in this kit. Alright, so we'll take the snap ring off. We're going to clean up all the surfaces on the shaft. That way the interlocking compound that we put on the gears will hold. On the clean surfaces, also clean off any grease that was there before or blue Loctite. While I'm here, you can see in the shop from the last portion of the video, we have kind of switched days. Shop looks a little different. We got a few new Yeti systems in from our 2021 snow check. So customers will be on their way today and tomorrow to come pick up their new systems that they're going to be installing. Wash it off with a little brake clean. All right, so these are the components for the new 2020 brake upgrade that is the recall for the 2018-2019 unit. So there is a new caliper that is redesigned internally with different brake pads and this foam snow shroud that goes around the caliper. That snow shroud will interlock with the shroud and create a snow shield for the brake rotor. Brake rotor is going to be inside of this, of course. It'll be inside here. And you also have a seal for the rotor too. So we'll go ahead and start reassembly of everything. I want to kind of dry off the brake clean. And the seal goes on first. You tuck it lip down and push it back behind the snap ring. Now we'll put the snap ring on. Pull the seal back up, because once this is all together, the plate will go around and the seal will seal to the plate. keeping as much snow out of the rotor as possible. Here is where we're going to use the Loctite 660 retaining compound. This retaining compound, of course, is going to help rotor to shaft engagement to make sure that we don't get rocking on the shaft, and of course wear on the internal hub of the rotor. Make sure that you take the sticker off of this rotor when you get it. Clean it up really good. Get all the glue off of it. You don't want that in your pads when you go to run this. I take my finger, make sure that the compound is evenly distributed down into the splines on both the shaft and the rotor. Don't get any on the bearing surfaces. If you get it on the bearing surface, make sure and clean it up. Now we're going to place the rotor onto the shaft. And let it settle all the way in. Push it all the way down to the snap ring. And on the SS kits, there's a spacer, not a snap ring, on the other side of this rotor. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do with suspension is when you call me, you want to talk about suspension setup. I'm always going to reference from 0. So 0 is loosening up the spring collar, and once you are completely unloaded on your spring where it rattles, that is 0. So you can hear spring rattle. You tighten up until spring rattle goes away. That's going to be 0. And part of our consultation on proper Yeti setup will be how to set your front springs to your weight, how to set your rebounding or compression on stage 3 Elkas, rebounding compression and high speed on stage 5 Elkas. Same thing in the rear. We're going to go till rattle, completely unloaded. Okay, now rattle's gone. And when we consult, I'll tell you X amount of turns from rattle front, X amount of turns from rattle rear. And I'll also tell you to set up your shocks. And once you're done with that, use your 3mm Allen, tighten back up your spring retainers so that they're not loose anymore. Then you can put your suspension back into the kit. While you have your suspension out, it's super easy. It's just 4 bolts. and track tension. But you want to check your high facts. For those of you that don't know, there's a wear bar on the high facts. So if you'll look at this cast seam line halfway down the high facts, that'll actually show you how much your high facts is worn. Your high facts can wear up into that wear bar, and then it'll be touching metal clip onto metal rail. So you always want to replace your high facts when you are almost to this wear point. Other things to check while you're here: you want to check your idler wheels to make sure that they spin freely. You want to make sure that your side bushings and placement bushings haven't come apart. You also want to check your front arm to see if you have any broken or bent tabs or bent front arm. Those are all good things to check when you're at this stage of having the suspension off. This customer is getting bogey wheels, so I'll go ahead and put bogey wheels on this kit while I've got it apart. Bogey wheels are super easy to do when you don't have the suspension in the track. And like I said, it's just a couple extra bolts to take apart, and it makes life a whole lot easier in most circumstances to work on it and do what you want to do. Okay, now that that's reassembled, we've checked everything out, we can go ahead and put it back in the kit. Like I kind of talked about before, make sure that you're holding these bushings on, because they do want to just fall off. As you put your suspension back in, just make sure that your rails are properly centered in the track, both front and rear. And I always like to start in the front upper mounted bolt. Just gonna move it into place. There is a small shoulder and cross shaft once you get it close, we'll just kind of set it too. Same thing on the other side. Get it in place. Do the rears. I know a lot of y'all want to know what I do for setup. And why my Yeti systems work as good as they do. It's all in that consultation that I do. So give me a call. I charge $200 for the consultation. I start out from everything from the front forks all the way down to the rear springs, whole setup, reasons why, spend all kinds of time with you doing all that stuff. We'll go ahead and retorque all of these cross shaft bolts to factory specs. .41 Newton meters on these, by the way. And I showed you this before, but here's my cheater's weight, 11 millimeters right inside the rail until it gets tight. That's tight between the nut and the rail. I'll go back and forth to make sure that I am the same distance side to side. I'll try to check tension and go and count revolutions. And once I've done that, I will go ahead and re-torque these rears axle bolts. To 55 Newton meters, which is factory spec. All right, so we're going back together with belt drive install. Make sure that you don't forget your 2 washers that go behind each gear drive. when you're installing your belt, make sure that the belt is fully seated in all of the teeth on both gears. You can install this belt and have it up on top of a set of teeth. All right, so now we've got our belt back on, and we want to go ahead and re-tension all of the pulleys. So we're going to set up to 61 Newton meters. All right, now we're going to want to set our belt tension, and our belt tension is done with this little red slider. I know it's super hard to see, but this red slider behind the belt can move anywhere in this belt slider area. And what you do is you take it over and you put it to where it's just on the back side of the belt right here. You push the belt with your finger, and when your fingernail turns white, that's the right amount of pressure, and you don't want that belt to move any more than that red slider. So we're going to adjust the belt tension to become a little bit tighter because we were moving almost all the way to the end of the slider. We're going to try it again. We're about 3/4. I'll give it just a little bit more tension. And this time we're about half of the slider. That's perfect. We're going to want to lock back down the lock nut for the tensioner. And then we're going to go down to 51 Newton meters for the idler wheel. And once you've got that, there is your belt tension. And we can put our cover back on. Little trick to putting cover back on. Just wiggle it so the pins lay down. Put the bottom of the cover in first. Let it slide all the way in. Give it a little pop on the top to make sure it's seated and resets down in the bottom. Put your 1/4 turn pins on and lay them down flat. And there's belt adjustment. Now we're going to talk about proper torque and what needs to be checked on a very regular basis, all the way from the first ride through, your 50th ride. Every part of maintenance, the very first ride through the 5th ride, you're going to want to check bolt tension on these 3 bolts. So we'll take the cover off. Your system will be attached to your bike, so you won't need the holder. And you're going to set your torque wrench to 61 Newton meters. And you'll check bolt tension here. And then we'll go down from 61. And we'll go to 55. We'll check our axle. 55. Then we'll go down to 51. We'll check our tension. And we'll grab our 12 millimeter. The first thing that we're going to check is our 41 Newton meter spec. So we have 4 on each end of the shock shafts. So upper shock shaft, lower shock shaft. Front, upper shock shaft rear, lower shock shaft rear. We'll just act like we're doing the other side. Then we're going to go down to our 25 Newton meter setting. And we're going to check front cross shaft between the rails. We're going to move back to our bogey wheels. Then we're going to move up to our front suspension arm lower mount on the rail. Then we're going to move to our reactor arm. Lower. Here it is. So, like we talked about in somewhat maintenance, right? We do all of those bolt checks the very first 5 rides. Once we're done with that, and we also check our belt tension while we're there. Once we're done with our first 5 rides, then we can kind of lighten up on some maintenance. We can go to every 3 rides now, checking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14 bolts. So basically everything associated with the suspension, I check every 3 rides. And then on the larger fasteners like we have here, I go to every 9 rides. So once our kit's good and broken in, every 3 rides, all the suspension fasteners, every 9 rides, the larger 17 millimeter fasteners. So there's kind of your bolt torques on suspension and belt drive. Hello YouTubers, Toby Till here with Rocky Mountain Snow MX. We are here to provide you with all of your snow bike related technical videos and also any parts or accessories you may need for your snow bike. Feel free to give us a call, 720-263-7533.